We talked about drop shadows and glows and other cool transparency effects in the Essential Training title. Now it's time to go deeper, exploring some of the more obscure but important features in the effects panel. For example, I recently got an email from someone who wanted to reduce the transparency of a text frame but keep the text solid. Let me show you what I mean. I've got my JavaCo magazine open here from the exercises folder, and I'm going to jump to page 4 by pressing Command-J on Mac or Control-J on Windows. Press 4, then Enter, and now I see that this text is in a white frame, a white text frame. I'll zoom in on this a little bit by pressing Command plus a couple times, or that's Control plus on Windows, just so we can see this a little bit better. And I want to change the background of this to something other than solid. So I'll open my effects panel. I'll go to the opacity. I'll just click on the text here to select all of that text so I don't have to drag over it. And then I'll set this to something like 60%. Well, the problem here is that the frame has a drop shadow. Do you see that? This frame actually has a drop shadow. The little FX icon tells us that there's some effect, and if I click on the effects pop-up menu, we can see that there's a check mark next to drop shadow. That means there's a drop shadow on this object. Well, because we changed the opacity of the object, we can see the drop shadow sneaking through there. We can see the drop shadow behind it. Well, that's really, really ugly. So how do we fix it? The first thing we're going to do is not change the opacity of the whole object to 60%, but we're going to change the opacity just of the fill itself, because we don't want the text to become transparent as well. So let's change the fill to something like 60%. There we go. We get a similar effect. We still see the drop shadow. In fact, here it's even worse because we can see a little bit of the drop shadow of the text as well. So that's even looking worse. What we'd like to do is apply the drop shadow not to the entire object, because we don't want it to apply to that text. We want to apply it just to the fill. Fortunately, I can grab this little effects icon and drag it down to the fill. And when I let go of the mouse button, we can now see that the drop shadow is applied only to the fill, not to the text anymore. But we still have that pesky drop shadow sneaking through. So what do I do about that? I need to edit the effect. And I'm going to do that by double-clicking on the effects icon here. I'll double-click on that, and it opens the effects dialog box. Move this out of the way just so we can see the background a little bit better. And we can see that the drop shadow effect is multiplying with 80% opacity and all this stuff that we talked about in the Essential Training title. There's one thing here that we didn't talk about before. It's this advanced feature called Object Knocks Out Shadow. Well, that sounds interesting. If we turn that on, and the preview checkbox is on, we can immediately see that, there we go, the object itself knocked out the shadow behind it. That means that we only see the shadow outside of the object. We won't see the shadow inside the object at all. What's this other checkbox? Shadow honors other effects. Well, this obviously has to do with other effects, and we don't have any effects on this currently, so let's go ahead and apply another effect so I can show you what that feature is going to do. I'll apply an outer glow. Let's do something like a big outer glow, and I'll set this to something like yellow. I just clicked on that little swatch here to open the color, and I'm going to change the blending mode to normal so we can see it a little bit better. Beef up the opacity to something like 85%. Let's make it bigger, maybe 2 picas, something really huge. Oh, I better add a little bit of noise. I'm just using the arrow keys on my keyboard. I always add a little bit of noise to make it a little bit more natural. But I can see that the glow around the object it's a little bit subtle. What's going on here is that the darkest part of the glow, let's say this 85% opacity, is just at the very edge of the object. Down here, at 2 picas away, it goes to 0%, right? So there's a subtle and even shift from 85% all the way down to 0. Well, the spread feature is all about where the darkest part should be. This 85% opacity, how far down should that go? If we increase this to something big like 50%, I'll hit Tab to tab out of this field, we can see that now we have a much more strong effect because halfway down through this 2 picas, so basically a whole pica down, we're getting 85%, and then it starts to drop off to 0. Right? So half of this 50% of the size will be the darkest opacity, and then it'll drop off to 0. So that's a way we can have a really strong effect. That's what spread is all about. Okay, we added a glow, but what happened to the drop shadow? It got completely obliterated, right? Well, let's go back to drop shadow, And now it's time to look at this feature, Shadow Honors Other Effects. There is another effect here. There's the glow. So when we turn this checkbox on, we can see that now the drop shadow doesn't just go behind the fill of this object, it actually goes behind the glow. So we have a glow and a drop shadow. Now, granted, that looks really weird and somewhat ugly, but, some people like that kind of thing. Without that glow and drop shadow at the same time, I probably couldn't show you what this feature was all about. So, it's pretty rare that you'd ever use Shadow Honors Other Effects, but it's good to know what it actually is. By the way, we saw spread in the glow. Spread also shows up here in drop shadow. And again, the spread is how far from the middle of this to the edge of it will we actually see the darkest opacity. If I turn on inner shadow, we'll just go totally overboard here, and add an inner shadow as well, we actually see the shadow showing up inside this frame now. There's also a spread feature in inner shadow, but they call it choke instead. Choke is the same thing. It's basically the amount of spread, but it goes in instead of out. So for example, if I set this to 25% and hit tab, in just a moment you'll see this click in. I'll hit tab, and now you see it actually goes in a little bit stronger instead of out. That's what choke is. Okay, let me click OK. And we'll see that this is a pretty horrifically ugly design. And we decide, forget it, I want to start all over again. Let's just remove all the effects features. How do we turn all of those off? Well, we can go to the effects panel and go to the flyout menu and choose clear effects. Another place I can find that, I won't select that yet, I can right-click on the effects icon here, or control-click on the Mac with a one-button mouse. So I'll click on that to get my context menu. I'll see all my effects have been applied here, and I have clear effects here as well. If I choose that, all of those effects, the drop shadow, the inner shadow, and so on, are removed, but the opacity remains. The basic transparency, blend mode, and opacity remains. If I wanted to remove all of the transparency effects, including opacity, I would have to choose Clear All Transparency instead. That removes all of the transparency effects and the transparency itself. So that's pretty cool. That's looking a little bit better. I want to show you one other trick having to do with cool effects that you can do in InDesign. I'm going to choose this text up here, and I can see that this text has a stroke and no fill. In fact, if I go down to the bottom of my tool palette and click this little T icon, that's the formatting applies to the text instead of the object, this will show me that I have stroke but no fill. I can reverse this, giving it a fill and no stroke, by clicking on this little double-headed arrow, and it's really hard to see that little icon, but it's just to the upper right of those fill and stroke icons, and if I click on that, I suddenly get the fill but no stroke, only applied to the text, not the object. Now what if I wanted to make this blurry, kind of blurry text? It's an effect, kind of a ghostly, foggy effect. It's something that a lot of people have tried to achieve, and it's actually quite difficult, or it seems like it's quite difficult in InDesign. Now, generally, if somebody wants a ghostly effect, they usually use the feathering feature. And the way they get that is they go to the effects panel, and they choose something like basic feather, and they apply a big feather to it. Let me move this down so you can see this better. To me, though, this is not a ghostly, soft effect. That's not at all what I'm looking for. This almost makes the text completely disappear. Even if I reduce the feather width by using my arrow keys on the keyboard to go down to, let's say, maybe 3, you can see that what's really happening here is just the edges of each character are being blurred out, and the middle, such as it is staying more or less the same. And that's just weird. I don't know. I don't like that effect at all. So instead, I'm not going to use a feather. I'm going to use a drop shadow. A drop shadow? What are you talking about? Well, drop shadows are very ghostly and they're very consistent throughout the entire thing, right? So what I really would like is a drop shadow, but no text. I want to make the text disappear and leave the drop shadow. And you can do that by creating a drop shadow with a blending mode of normal, and I'll change the color to something like this green color and set this OK. Maybe I'll bump this up a little bit to like 90%. Better add a little bit of noise, make it a little bit more natural, just a few percent would be good. And that's looking pretty good, except I'm going to set the distance to 0. Distance to 0 means put the drop shadow exactly underneath the original text. That's where I want to put that ghostly effect. And I'll go ahead and click OK. So I've got my ghostly text, but it's covered up by my solid text. How do I make that text disappear? Well, I make text disappear by first changing the color of the text not the object itself, but I click on the little T icon, I'm changing the color of the text to paper. So there we go. The text disappeared, but it actually knocked out the drop shadow. And that's kind of a cool effect all by itself. In fact, why don't I go to the View menu and choose Display Performance, High Quality Display, and that'll actually make it smoother and much nicer to look at. That's kind of an interesting effect. I like it. Maybe I'll use that sometime. But in this case, I'm really trying to make the text disappear, so all that's left is that shadow. So I'm going to go back to my effects panel, and I'm going to click off of it and then click back on it. That's just a fast way to make this kick back in. And I'm going to set the text blending mode. First I'll click on the text here, then I'll go to the blending mode pop-up menu and change it to multiply. Look at that. It just completely disappears. Multiply on paper color means disappear. Paper always disappears when you set it to multiply. But because the object itself has a drop shadow, that remains. So we have our blurry text. We can actually change this and get different effects. I'll double click on the effects icon, move this out of the way. And why don't I do some other kind of wacky effects? For example, I can increase the noise amount to something like 40%. And now I get kind of a grunge effect. It's kind of an interesting grungy looking effect here. I could change the size of it and make it bigger or make it smaller. And I have a lot of control over what kind of wacky effects I'm going to create there. I'll even increase this up to 100%, and we can see that it's almost like a sand or grit on the page. Sure, InDesign is a page layout program, but it's also a designer's playground. And the more you play, the more you'll find yourself amazed at what you can accomplish with these transparency effects without ever having to switch to another program.